Thank you very much. Brian Jenks, weed scientist, NDSU Research Center in Minot. I'm going to share a few things about weed issues in canola. One of the questions that came up earlier was about this allelopathic effect of rye on canola. And I just wanted to pass on this little tidbit of information from Alberta Canola. They had a project where they looked at the effect of fall rye cover crop on canola emergence. And it says here, termination of the cover crop 8 days before planting resulted in 0 canola emergence, whereas termination of the cover crop 21 days before planting resulted in 87% canola emergence. So the recommendation here certainly was to, if you're going to have a rye cover crop, to terminate it at least 21 days before planting canola. Now, we do know, I'm not a rye allelopathic expert, but we do know that smaller seeds are more sensitive to allelochemicals. So a canola would be more sensitive than, say, a soybean or a pea or chickpea, corn, etc. But also in some cases, reduced crop growth may be due to the suppressive effect of rye biomass and not necessarily phytotoxic chemicals. So just keep that in mind. One other thing I found was, I think there's a lot of information out there about rye and its allelopathic effect, but there's also I think there's a lot of things that we don't know. And there's some information out there that maybe isn't exactly explainable or makes you scratch your head. For example, in this study from the Canadian Journal of Plant Science, they showed that extracts from rye significantly inhibited germination of pigweed and foxtail, but had no effect on navy bean. However, in a second study, they looked at rye, wheat, and triticale. This is winter wheat. And it says the rye, wheat, triticale provided similar inhibition of weed seed germination. However, effects on bean germination differed between the cereals. The bean seed germination was significantly reduced by winter wheat and winter triticale, but unaffected by rye. So that made me scratch my head. So anyway, I just wanted to share that. I don't have an explanation for this, but since the topic came up, I thought I would throw it in here. Okay, getting back to weeds. So given our drought, everybody's got kochia and kochia in canola. For those that are conducting or have no-till systems, you always want to use a take mix partner with Roundup in your pre-plant or pre-emergence burn down. Primarily because I'd say many people have Roundup resistant kochia. If you don't, you may very well soon, and you can certainly help yourself if you do use a tank mix partner with Roundup in your burn down. Now you could tank mix Roundup with AIM. That's certainly an option. And that's probably one of the limited options that you have to tank mix. Now I'm talking specifically about and only about canola here. AIM is an option. You can use Liberty to as a burn down in front of canola. I'm not saying tank mix the Liberty with the Roundup. I'm saying Liberty by itself could be done. And then Gramoxone is certainly an option before canola. Now, with the limited amounts of Liberty supposedly out there, maybe you don't want to use Liberty this year as a burn down, but if you were desperate, maybe it's an option. Also want to comment on kochia and the starring resistance we're seeing in some parts of the state. Sometimes we see the growing point is stopped or suppressed, but then we see branching that starts to occur and the plant regrows. So the recommendation is to not use starring by itself anymore. Don't use wide match alone or starring alone. Use another take mix partner that has good suppressive effect on kochia so that you've got two modes of action in wheat. so that you can try and clean up the kochia in the wheat before you go to the canola crop. So some wheat herbicides to consider where you've got at least 2 or 3 modes of action. One would be Husky FX, which has styrene, bromoxynil, and pyrosulfatol. So you've got 3 modes of action there that are quite effective on canola or on kochia. Another option is Talinor, and there isn't a product called Talinor plus styrene, but I'm just saying if you can tank mix Talinor with styrene, would recommend it. So you'd have styrene, bromoxynil, and bicyclopyrrone. So you got 3 different modes of action there on kochia. A couple other options, Kochivore, and these are just some options. This is not an all-inclusive list. Kochivore has styrene, bromoxynil 2,4-D, whereas Carnivore has styrene, bromoxynil, MCP. And then Clean Sweep D and Clean Sweep M are very similar to Kochivore and Carnivore with a styrene, bromoxynil, and 2,4-D or MCP. Styrene NXT has styrene plus bromoxynil. However, this styrene NXT does have a significantly lower amount of styrene in it. So I'd rather use one of these products up here, preferably the products with the 3 modes of action. But I do think these Kochivore Clean Sweep type products can work very well also. So one of the things you have to consider when using these herbicides is the crop rotations. Husky FX has some rotation restrictions. Specifically for canola, it's only 9 months, so you shouldn't have to worry about Husky FX going to canola. But if you're going to something like a lentil, you certainly wouldn't be able to go to a lentil the following year. Talinor has a few more restrictions. Going specifically to canola, it's 9 or 10 months, so there shouldn't be a concern going to canola. But if you're going to other crops, certainly there is some crops to consider. And note that crop rotation varies by rate and by county with Talinor. So for example, the northwestern counties, you wouldn't be, if you use Talinor, you wouldn't be planting lentil or probably peas the following year. So you'd have to read the label and see what the label says specifically about your county. Okay, some of the common weed control methods that we use in canola. A lot of the eastern part of the state uses conventional tillage, where they might just do a spring tillage and then followed post-emergence with either a Liberty or 1 or 2 applications of Roundup. In the western part of the state, probably use a lot more no-till systems, where you might use a Roundup burn down and then again come back post-emergence with Liberty or Roundup. Other options that are still out there that we used to use before the Roundup and Liberty days, Treflan, Sonland, used to apply some of those in the fall to help reduce weed growth emerging in the spring. Beyond and Clearfield canola, certainly still an option. And then draft in SU canola if those varieties are still around. So for Roundup Ready canola, Roundup Ready, the Roundup Ready 1 system that we had for many years. We applied 16 ounces of Paramax either once or twice. Maximum M crop allowed was 22 ounces of Paramax. The TrueFlex system allows you to, the TrueFlex varieties allow you to apply a higher rate, up to 44 fluid ounces from emergence through 6 leaf. You can apply Paramax from 6th leaf through first flower, only 22 ounces, but no more than 2 in-crop applications. With Liberty, we always apply it with AMS, 22 to 29 ounces, maximum in-crop rate 58, maximum season total 87. So yes, in theory, you could apply Liberty as a pre-plant or and then twice in crop, but probably prefer not to do that. we don't want that many applications going out and applying them as selection pressure with Liberty. And as usual, we always mention Liberty is much more effective with a lot of sun, heat, and humidity. Regarding grasses, Liberty isn't the best on grasses, so we typically tank mix with a full rate of Select to help control the grasses. Especially Liberty is weak on yellow foxtail, and once you get grasses, whether it's wild oat or volunteer cereals greater than 3 leaf, Liberty will tend to struggle. A stack trait canola, those varieties exist, Roundup Ready plus Liberty Link. The pros of this system would be you'd be able to spray a Liberty one pass and then Roundup the next pass or vice versa. The cons of this system might be having to deal with the volunteers, Liberty versus Roundup Ready volunteers. We know some of the Roundup weaknesses are Roundup resistant kochia, Roundup resistant horseweed, Roundup's weak on mallow, weak on wild buckwheat. Some of the Liberty weaknesses, grasses, as I mentioned before, especially the larger grasses, lamb's quarters, larger broadleaves, and then the weather conditions can certainly affect Liberty, such as low sunlight, humidity, and temps. Okay, some of the Roundup resistant weeds, horseweed. We do have horseweed across the state. Horseweed is basically a no-till weed. If you do conventional tillage, horseweed generally is not a problem because it emerges in the fall. So options for horseweed, a Roundup plus AIM. If the horseweed is not resistant, if the horseweed is resistant, then obviously the Roundup is not going to help, and the AIM may not be sufficient. So you may have to consider something like a Gramoxone or a Liberty in a burn down to control that horseweed. Now, horseweed is best controlled in the fall, so we certainly recommend you consider trying to control horseweed in the fall. Liberty in crop is usually very good on horseweed. Definitely want to apply it when it's small, 29 ounces. If you have to, you could come back with Stinger to control horseweed. Roundup Ready canola in crop, if it's not resistant to Roundup, you could use Roundup, or again, you could use Stinger. For kochia, again, I mentioned this earlier, Roundup plus AIM is an option, Gramoxone or Liberty. And then Liberty in crop could go 1 or 2 applications. Definitely want to target kochia that's only about 3 inches. Once kochia gets 4 inches or more, Liberty is going to struggle on kochia. And then this is questionable using Roundup to control kochia. Many of us can't use this or rely on this anymore because of Roundup resistant kochia. Some other tough weeds, marsh elder is usually controlled by Roundup, Liberty, or Stinger. Common ragweed. In the eastern part of the state, there's some fields that have glyphosate resistant ragweed, but Liberty and Stinger are generally effective on ragweed. Canada thistle, Roundup and Stinger, very effective on thistle. Wild oat should be easily controlled with Roundup or a Liberty plus Select full rate when the grass is small. One herbicide that is not brand new, it's been around for a couple of years, called Elevore. There is a 14-day pre-plant interval to canola, so I'm not sure how useful that's going to be, but it is another mode of action. It's a group 4 growth regulator, and one of the claims to fame for it is the control of horseweed. So if you're in no-till and you wanted to use Elevore, you could. It may not be the best option, but it is an option, and as it does control some other weeds and suppresses these weeds over here. One herbicide that has been talked about a little bit that is new, it is called Reviton. It is not currently labeled for canola, nor should it be in the future, but I just wanted to bring this to your attention in case somebody tried to sell you some Reviton. Reviton is being touted as being similar to or better than AIM or Sharpen. right on the label, the product says that it has no pre-emergence activity, meaning it has no soil activity. We conducted a study this year where we looked at canola tolerance to pre-plant and pre-herbicides, and we looked at Reviton at 1, 2, and 4 ounces compared to Roundup alone. This is the pre-plant canola density, and or this was the pre-plant treatment. This is the density in plants per meter of row. So where we sprayed Roundup alone, we had 6.5 plants per meter of row. Yes, we had a drought. But where we sprayed the Reviton, you can see that the canola density significantly decreased, whether it was pre-plant, not quite as bad in the pre, but definitely decreased. And so this statement that Reviton has no pre-emergence activity is not accurate and should be removed from their label, because this certainly shows that Reviton does have pre-emergence activity. Just dealing with weed resistance, just advise you to be careful with short rotations, especially with 2-year rotations, such as a canola wheat or a soybean wheat. Usually getting 3 or 4 crops in the rotation definitely helps us reduce the chances of weed resistance. Just a quick note on canola desiccation. I don't think people desiccate that much anymore, but if you do, Diquat is probably the best choice for desiccating. This is Diquat 3 days after treatment on the left and the untreated on the right. We conducted a study many years ago where we looked at timing of applying the desiccants. The pods here shown, this is over here, this is the bottom pods. We know that the canola matures from the bottom up. So these would be the bottom pods, middle pods, and top pods. And this is pods on July 7, August 1, and August 7. So you can see how the plant matures and the seeds start to turn color over time. A summary of the results showed that applying the desiccant before seeds in the middle pods had turned color resulted in higher green count, lower yield, and lower test weight. Swathing too early also caused similar results. So what this shows is if we desiccated or swathed before the seeds in these middle pods turned, and I should say, well, were well turned, if we desiccated before this time, then we did lose yield and test weight. So you want to open up the pods and look at it, look at the seeds in here. And this would be the earliest that you'd want to be applying the desiccant. And using the desiccant, we really did not lose much to shattering. It wasn't an issue. But desiccating and swathing canola, where it was harvested 14 days after treatment, had lower green count than canola harvested 7 days after treatment. Last slide here. Diquat was the most effective for desiccating the pods and stems 3 to 10 days after treatment. It was very consistent at reducing seed moisture. Visually, Sharpen plus glyphosate was not as effective at 7 days as Diquat, but did provide acceptable desiccation after 10 to 14 days. It reduced seed moisture slightly less than Diquat, but Sharpen and Valor applied alone were less effective. So the best treatment for desiccating was Diquat. Sharpen and glyphosate were effective, but you had to wait 10 to 14 days to see the results that were then maybe similar to Diquat. But for the fastest desiccation, most effective, Diquat was the best there. That's all I have. Any questions?